Hello, it's Amy. I'm here with another essay. This one is titled The Art of the Reviewer, 7 Ways of Reviewing, and this is another selection from A Bookman's Letters by W. Robertson Nicoll. And so, it's 7 ways of reviewing. There are 7 ways of reviewing. Yea, there are 8, but at present it will be enough to stick to the 7. Number 1, the ostentatious essay. The reviewer in this kind has little or nothing to say about the book which is supposed to be under notice. He takes occasion to display his own knowledge, and is recalled to the fact that he is expected to write, not an essay, but a review at the 11th hour, when there is but a corner of his space to be filled. Suppose he has to deal with a new edition of the Letters of Obscure Men, edited carefully, let us say, by Mr. Smith. The ostentatious essayist will begin early. He may perhaps trace the first glimmerings of the dawn of the new learning in Europe, penetrating into the darkness of the scholastic philosophy. The dispute between the nominalists and the realists will next engage him, and William of Ockham presents an inviting theme, especially if the reviewer happens to know Principal Lindsay's essay on that subject. Quotations from Cardinal Nicholas von Cusa and Rudolf Agricola look well. Next, a brief survey of the Italian Renaissance literature and an estimate of its influence on the Germans may come in. Readers are referred to the works of Geiger, with which the reviewer is apparently on the most intimate terms. A few sagacious, though inconclusive, observations on the authorship of the letters are now in order, and by this time the critic has wakened up to the fact that 2 7/8 of the 3 columns allowed him as a maximum by a grudging editor have now been filled. Suddenly the book before him catches his eye. It occurs to him that he was meant to review it. He will probably feel some compunctions and end his task with a complimentary sentence in which that convenient phrase, on the whole, is pretty certain to occur. This is not the worst kind of review. It is a kind detested by authors and disliked by publishers. But if it is well done by a competent person, the reader may get some good of it. And I have to say, I do quite enjoy those sorts of reviews. But I think maybe it's because I perhaps don't really like to read book reviews all that much. But when the reviewer is ostentatious, as he says, or gets sidetracked and distracted by adjacent topics, I think I do tend to quite enjoy that a lot. But the second type of review is the hypocritical review. By this I mean the review of the expert who is intent on finding mistakes. And I think I've come across, some of these reviews too. The kind of reviewer who goes in just looking for mistakes or inaccuracies or things they don't like to comment on. The passion for accuracy is admirable, and in many cases in which books are written with scandalous ignorance and carelessness, the expert is doing the public a service when he exposes a fraud. Many shoddy pseudo-historical books of our time ought to be reviewed much more thoroughly and severely than they are, but the passion for accuracy may mislead a reviewer. It may even carry him unawares into a certain malicious pedantry. There is perhaps no such field for the hypocritic as accents. Accents are troublesome in French, in Italian, in Greek, and no doubt in many languages not known to me. In an English book where French is freely used, the accents are perhaps hardly ever rightly quite given. But I call it hypercriticism when a reviewer writes, "Our author is evidently unaware that the word déjà has 2 accents in French," or when he writes, "Mr. Blank fancies that he can read Italian, yet we see him actually putting an acute accent on the word E." Next to accents, the great chance for the hypercritic is to be found in dates. Hardly any writer is immaculate in that respect. Some readers may remember James Rowley's attack on J.R. Green's Short History of England, published in Fraser many years ago. Rowley was undoubtedly right in many of his criticisms, but S.R. Gardner gave the proper reply when he said that mistakes in dates did not necessarily prove much, if anything, against the real merits of a book. E.A. Freeman was not a fair critic on the whole, and he made a great deal too much of trivial inaccuracies. Since he died, historians have risen who have disputed many of his own statements. Still, I say the hypercritic has a chance, especially if he knows the difference between old style and new style. Dr. Blank is under the extraordinary misconception that Calvin died in 1561. The hypercritic should bear two facts in mind. One, no historical book was ever written that did not contain some slips. Two, in many cases the slips are due to the printer. It may be said that the author should correct them in proof. So he should, but many authors are bad proofreaders. Also, it will happen that the printers fail to carry out corrections made in proof. Well then, I am told authors should get friends to correct their proofs for them. Do people understand what it means to correct the proofs of a historical book properly? It means that you must practically go over the whole ground trodden by the author, and that for no reward. The casual glancing at proofs is a good service to a friend and may help him to avoid obvious blunders. But to expect any friend to revise proofs as they should be revised is to expect too much. The hypercritic therefore ought to show some modesty and consideration. Unless he can show that his author is really untrustworthy, he should make allowance for some mistakes and accept them as misprints if he can. And I do quite agree on that point. Here I may relate a little experience which raises an ethical question. Some years ago I reviewed a little biography by a well-known author and remarked that the proofs had not been properly read. The author wrote to me saying that he had taken special pains with his proofs, putting them in the hands of some well-known men of letters, whom he named. He asked me to specify the mistakes I had found. I put the letter aside, intending to look up the book again and reply, and unfortunately forgot all about it. Later on, in an essay on critics, the same writer returned to the charge. He said that, generally speaking, he had been well treated by reviewers, but that on one occasion a man, meaning me, had said that his proofs had not been well read, etc., etc. On this I looked up the book in question and found a certain number of errors in the first few pages. Then irritation calmed down, and I simply could not compel myself to go over the book again. There the matter rests, but I may yet read the book and take up the controversy. My conduct in forgetting the letter was inexcusable. But was I bound to read the book a second time and supply the author with a list of corrections? I think not. And review type number 3. The Man of All Works review. To almost every journal is attached a reviewer who is a man of all works. It is his business to do the short reviews. He is understood to be able and willing to undertake any parcel of volumes that may be sent to him. His parcel will contain, all sorts and conditions of books, novels, treatises about Christian science and Anglo-Israelitism, school books, editions of the classics, medical books, works on the secret of the universe, and minor poems. He has to get notices of these into a column or two. This man of all work is generally an intelligent person. He can see whether an author is obviously incompetent. He knows all about and rich and the split infinitive. He can tell by looking at the authorities quoted what class each volume belongs to. Above all things, he knows where the ice is thin. He is exceedingly cautious in committing himself. As he is not usually well paid, he deals in extracts as much as possible. The gentleman finds in his parcel one evening a work on that extensive subject, the stellar universe. He does not know any astronomy. He cannot name a single star in the heavens. But he examines the book, beginning with the preface. The preface, if judiciously written, supplies him with a fair portion of the review. Then he turns to the titles of the chapters and enumerates them more or less fully. He then looks to see whether there is anything about the inhabitants of Mars, and quotes a racy passage, headed in black type, "Is Mars inhabited?" Then comes an appetizing little extract, also headed, "On the craters of the moon." If he is very young, he will probably assert his individuality by saying that if the moon is inhabited, the fact that so large a space is occupied by only one individual must press hard on the minds of really serious thinkers. This the reviewing editor will be sure to blue pencil. The last sentence will be something like this: "This volume is well worth consulting by all students of astronomy." The publishers are moderately satisfied with this review. The author is not at all satisfied. But the miscellaneous reviewer is not such a fool as people think him. He knows his way about through snares and pitfalls, and generally has traveled it for many a mile. Type number 4, the puff. This kind of review is ancient and lively. We need not go far to find it. We shall never need to go far. Mr. Vaughan Robinson's very latest work of fiction is to be noticed, and the notice runs thus. Mr. Vaughan Robinson's enormous and worldwide public will hail with rapturous delight the appearance of this masterpiece of fiction. In our opinion, he touches in this book his high watermark. As compared with his novel, which we reviewed 3 months ago, this book shows an amazing literary development. There is much in these pages which reminds us of Dickens, the rich humor, the bubbling gaiety, the vivid and graphic sketches of character. But in the quiet and deadly irony of some of his passages, Mr. Vaughan Robinson has no rival, save perhaps in the immortal pages of Thackeray. In this instance, however, comparisons are idle. Mr. Vaughan Robinson has the gift of condensation. He wastes no space, introduces no irrelevant episodes, and no adroit reflections. In 100,000 words or fewer, he does the work which Thackeray and Dickens barely accomplished in 500,000. This kind of review probably pleases authors, but I doubt whether it does them much good. In one of his stories, Ian McLaren satirizes the gutting testimonial written by the Reverend Professor Macduff McLear, D.D., for a probationer. In this, the professor describes the Reverend Hiram Clunas as a ripe scholar, a profound divine and eloquent preacher, a faithful pastor, an experienced Christian with an attractive and popular manner, and general knowledge of a varied and rich character. The testimonial that is worthwhile is that from the great scholar Dr. Zechariah Carfin, who describes his friend as fully competent to expound the Hebrew scriptures after an accurate and spiritual fashion to any body of intelligent people. Pardon me, it is my foolishness, but you notice fully. This extremity of language is, I need not say, undeserved, but that Mr. Carfin should have written it, a compensation for many little disappointments. And the fifth kind of review, the malignant review. I wish I could say that the malignant review was extinct. It is happily not so common as it was. Happily also, respectable editors are settling their faces against it. Still, you come across it pretty often. It is a review in which a book has been judged before it has been read. The author is criticized not for what he has written, but for his particular views, political or religious. The word goes round that no good thing can come out of that camp, and no work of genuine merit is pooh-poohed. The history of literary criticism in this country is not a very long history, has many dark passages recording these iniquities. Far worse is the case of a reviewer who has a personal quarrel with his author and tries to avenge himself. This also is not rare. No man of honor will ever allow himself to criticize a book by a man who is a personal antagonist. Let him seek refuge, if he must, in a Salvation Army shelter. Anything rather than run the risk of indulging personal rancor by an apparently honest and candid criticism. The day will come when this kind of attack will be considered so infamous as to debar its perpetrators from all decent society and exclude them all from respectable newspapers. Now that's interesting. I don't think this kind of reviewing has gone away. In fact, I think probably in the age of the internet, that kind of reviewing has become increasingly popular, not necessarily, in established publications, but certainly, anyone can criticize an author's work quite easily if they have a bone to pick with that author. And I think I've seen it, many times where you can tell that the particular person talking about a particular work dislike the work less because they've read it in its entirety and have given it an honest review, and more because of their notions about the person writing it. The sixth kind of review, the honestly enthusiastic review. There is no such pleasure in a reviewer's life as when he comes across a book of sterling merit by an author previously unknown to him. Then he legitimately enjoys to the full the noble pleasure of praising. It is not a very common experience by the very nature of the case. To find a sovereign where you're expected to find at most a sixpence is a surprise, but open and appreciative minds do come on this pleasure sometimes. and it is a pleasure which often leads to much. It is no easy matter for a new writer, however gifted, to make his way. If there is stuff in him, he will come to his own by degrees, but he may be spared many a heartache by a strong and cordial word of praise at the right time. The happy reviewer who has a chance of speaking this word may occasionally find that his life has been enriched by a precious friendship. And the seventh and final type of review that he's going to discuss in this essay is the right kind of review. By the right kind of review, I mean the honest and careful criticism of a competent judge. Let me suppose that I have written a sound book on socialism, giving thereto a careful study of many months and of many books in various languages. It will please me if I find my critic saying that the subject has been carefully studied and that the results are presented in a clear and impartial way. But something more than that should be found here and there. Let me have a critic who knows more than I do, or at least who has read in directions I have not followed out. Let me be able to see that he has read and pondered and understood all that I have written. His praise will then be very sweet. His criticisms will be thankfully received and considered even when they are not accepted. I shall feel to my critic as Charlotte Bronte felt to Sidney Dobell when she read his review of her sister's Wuthering Heights. The article in the Palladium is one of those notices over which an author rejoices trembling. He rejoices to find his work finely, fully, fervently appreciated, and trembles under the responsibility such appreciation seems to devolve upon him. There ought to be at least some periodicals and newspapers in this country in which an author who has done his duty may look for just appraisement. And, I think that's somewhat interesting that the focus of this essay does seem to be on the author and whether these types of reviewing styles are, pleasing or beneficial to the author. He does mention, readers, the audience a few times, but you can tell this is definitely coming from an author's perspective. And there is the next chapter, the next essay here is titled The Art of the Reviewer, continued, and it looks like he's going to talk about literary gossip and the 8th way of reviewing. So I may return with a reading of this next essay here, just so you can join me in discovering what that's all about.